Okay, so welcome. We're doing the follow-up presentation on building of this Greene and Greene nightstand. Previously, we talked about things like wood selection, grain orientation, milling processes, stickering and stacking, and wood movement issues, along with then into joinery, glue ups, shaping with templates and hand shaping and various aspects of construction up to the point of having finish put on. So tonight, what we're going to talk about, and those were more or less generic in that those issues and methods would apply regardless of the style that you're building in. What I'm going to talk about tonight is specifically details that Greene and Greene used in their design of their furniture pieces 100 years ago. This piece is one that is mostly based on furniture that they built in the Blacker House in Pasadena. And there are a number of them from other houses that I'll be talking about as well. And there are some that are generic across their whole breadth of furniture that they built. So we're going to talk about things like the leg indent at the bottom on this guy. This is actually something that came primarily from the Blacker House. We're going to talk about ebony details like pegs or buttons, the ebony splines on the breadboard ends. We'll also get into things like the block and dowel pull for the drawer and methods that we use for construction for that. I'll talk a little bit about how I attach tops to the base to accommodate wood movement, so we don't have, this is a solid wood top, so it's going to move. And if you don't attach it properly, it could break apart the lower portion of the furniture piece. So we need to be careful about that. And there'll be a couple of those other small things that we'll throw in there too at some point. So let's start with the indent on the leg. And what the indent does on this leg is very similar to a ball and claw foot from 150 years ago. It lightens up the piece by having a ramped taper coming down towards the foot, and then it expands it out. So it has that mass at the bottom, which helps to ground the piece. So it gives it a connection with the floor, with the ground. And the way we're going to go about doing that, and that's a little tough to see there, but you'll have a close up here as we get into that a little more. But basically, it ramps into the leg as it goes down, and these appear on all four sides of each of the legs. So with that, I'm going to move the table out of the way here for a second. And okay, so the indent, and maybe you can see it better there. Okay, so you can see that it ramps in. It's shallow up at this end, goes from nothing down to about 1/8 of an inch deep on the at the foot of the leg. And yet, if you look at it, it really is the same as a mortise, but it's shallow and it's ramped. But the fact that it is basically a mortise leads us to how we're going to go about doing it. Last time we talked about using a jig here for doing the mortising in the aprons and in the legs, where we have an opening that the template guide fits into, gives you the length of the mortise that you want to make. This is meant to put an even, consistent depth mortise, which is traditional for furniture. The jig we're going to use to do the ramp looks very much similar. The difference here is the bottom of the leg goes down at the bottom here, and you'll notice up at the top there's a spacer block attached here. And what that does, leg sets in there, the bottom fits against the stop at the bottom end, and the top, I'll show you the back side of the jig here. Now you can see that spacer block underneath, right underneath the leg. There's a spacer block that holds that end of the leg up about 3/8 of an inch. And if you look at the leg in this jig, you'll see that you can see the taper there. So it goes from nothing back here to about 3/16 of an inch. So what that does, I'm going to set this down, Greg, and then maybe let you zoom in a little bit closer there. What I've done here is I've drawn on the edge of the plywood here. You'll see that there's both a blue and a red line, but it is tapered, and that represents basically the angle that the leg is in that jig. And is this going to show? Okay, so if I was to, the key thing here is this surface is flat. This is what the router is going to ride on. So when we drop the bit down, the bottom of the bit is going to stay at a fixed distance down from this surface. But the fact that we have mounted the leg in the jig with one end raised means that the router bit is going to plow into the leg as we move it along because of the taper. Okay, so this square could represent the bottom of the router bit, and if you see it up close there, it's like right there at the bottom of the red line. As we pull it along, see how it goes below it now? Goes below it by about 1/8 of an inch. So that's the ramping going down into the wood. That's how we get that ramp effect in there. Okay. And that is fairly simply done. When we put it into the jig like this, we just then take the whole thing and we're going to clamp all the way across these brace pieces. So that now holds the leg at an angle. We've got a fixed window here that locks in the width of the mortise we're going to put in here, the indent. The next thing is going to be determined is going to be where it starts. And I think you can see there's a pencil mark here. That's where I was intending to have the ramping start. So the way we go about this is with the template guide bushing on the plunge router. And this is a 1/2 inch spiral upcut bit. So it'll give us a nice clean cut. So the way we go about this then is we bring the plunge router over to the line where we want the ramping to start. We have to put the bit there. Then we drop the router down until it makes contact with the wood and lock it there. Now I'm going to set the depth stop. Now I can release it. Now I can go back over here and the leg is tapering away from me. It's going down there. So the router bit is not making contact over there now. So I would fire up the router now, plunge it down to the stop, and all I have to do is bring it down one side, across, and up the other side. And that'll end up leaving, since it's a 1/2 inch bit and it's a little over 1 inch wide ramp that I'm putting in there, I need to come back and do a little squiggle down the middle to take out a little bit of material in the middle. So that ends up giving us something that looks like that. So we do that on all 4 sides all the way around. You can also change the length of this ramping by, remember I said I wanted to start where the line was. If I want it to start up higher, then that's where I do that first setting of the bit down on the wood. That will be the new start point. Thing you have to be careful about with something like this is, in the case of this table, there's a stretcher that runs between the legs all the way around. If you let this ramp go up too high, now you've got a stretcher that's in the ramp and you've got an compound angle to have to deal with. So you need to be aware of where you want to start and stop. From there, it's the rest of the shaping is fairly straightforward. I made a little sanding block that's just a little bit narrower than what the ramp is. I put a little radius on the end of it. Put a radius on the 2 corners. So it sort of fits into that radius. Wrap a piece of sandpaper around it, and that's how I go about sanding the flat. Clean that up. And then in rounding over the edges, it's just a matter of folding up paper, and it's by hand, you're just working it around to get those softened up and rounded over. There's nothing very complicated there. It's time consuming though. It's hand sanding detail. It does take time, but it's a great look. And you can change the weighting of this. Actually, I think I've got a variation on this one piece here even. The width of the ramp in this case leaves about 1/4 of an inch of material on each side, versus this side where there's only about 1/8 of an inch of material left out here. So you can get a very different look by changing the width of the ramp and the length of it. And it's one of those details that many people don't realize is there until the 2nd or 3rd time they've seen the piece, because the lighting will cast shadows very differently one day versus another. So let's go with that. Any questions on that? Any additional information you'd like to hear about?
Yeah, George, I have a question.
Yep.
Yeah, in terms of holding that leg, is your clamp actually holding the leg in position from letting it drop down?
Yeah, no, actually that has to do with the jig, and when you build the jig, the jig needs to match the leg. So if you're going to do a leg that's 1.5 inches square, you build a jig where these 2 guide arms are just a hair over that 1.5 inches. If you're going to do 1 5/8 legs, you need another jig with that spacing different. So it's a slip fit into there, but that allows enough flexibility that when the vise pinches on these 2 bars, it has enough friction that it'll hold the leg in place and hold the jig solid against it. Got it. Even when you're plunging. Okay. Right. Yeah, it is very solid. Yeah, and I said basically it amounts to, when you build the jig, if you mill the piece to the size you want it to be, wrap a piece of notebook paper around the leg and put it in place, and then bring your clamps up against that and lock them in place there, and that'll allow you just about the right amount of give to be able to slide the leg in and out. Okay. And then when you're milling up all of your legs, so then you're building this jig as a standard for future projects as well that might have 1.5 inch square leg. When you mill the legs for the piece you're building, you mill them, and when you get down to that final dimension, you're taking it back over to this jig and making sure it'll fit in here. Got it. That makes sense? Totally. Don't go by the number as the gospel in this case. You go until you mill the leg until it fits the jig that's specifically made to do an operation for you. Daryl Peart developed many of these procedures, and I learned them building with him, and then we both have kind of gone and made modifications to them over time. This jig is one that I know is in his first book, which we do have in the library. And there are actually all of those that I'm going to be talking about tonight are in that first book that Daryl did on Greene and Greene design, Greene and Greene style.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Great.
All right. Anybody else? Anything?
Anyone else? Doesn't look like it.
Another leg detail. That indent design came from the Blacker house. The Gamble house in Pasadena has numerous pieces of furniture throughout that house that have this, what we're calling a waterfall detail. It's a 3-step down ramping, and that occurs on both of the inside faces of a leg. So it gradually tapers it down from 1.5 inches square down to about 1.25 inches square at the actual foot. So it gives more of a lightening effect, a lift effect to the piece that has this kind of a detail on it. And they used this on pieces that had very beefy legs and some that were actually already pretty dainty. This is 1.5 inches square. There's an end table in the living room at the Gamble house that the leg itself is actually only 1 inch square, and it has the 2 tapers down as well, but it just again adds a focal point to it and a lightening effect. And this is accomplished by pretty straightforward template routing, like we talked about before. So the shape is cut on the base of the jig, and the bearing of your flush trim router bit rides. The bearing is here by my finger. There's one on both bottom and the top, but this one gets lined up with the bottom of the jig, and it'll follow along and then step down on off. And then you just rotate the piece to do the other side. So that's a very straightforward template shaping exercise. But again, another way to treat legs other than having straight square appearances to them. So there's a lot more visual interest to the piece. Okay. So I think at this point, let's talk a little bit about the ebony details, because Greene and Greene used a lot of ebony as accent in their pieces, and the square pillowed ebony. Some people call them buttons, some people call them pegs, some people call them plugs, but it gives the appearance that there is a physical pin holding a mortise and tenon joint together. In some cases, that truly is the case. In most cases in Greene and Greene furniture, it actually is more aesthetic than functional, and it's put there for looks. And we know that in at least some cases, because there have been some of their furniture pieces that have been x-rayed by museums where some of those original pieces have been living. And we can see with the x-rays that there isn't any peg or screw or pin behind that ebony button. It's just there for visual. So at any rate, let me try to do this way so you can kind of see. There can be any variation. What I'm wanting to show you there is the height. The height of the button is what I call the one on this end. Started at this end is very close to flush. It barely sticks up above the surface of the wood. The one in the middle is up a little bit, and the one back on this end is more bulbous, I guess is what I would call it. But there are examples of all 3 of these flavors in Greene and Greene original pieces, and the The style you want to go for is up to you. They all work. I tend to lean towards the just barely there. When you run if you had closed your eyes and ran your hands over the furniture, you would know there's something there, and would just make you wonder. It's all soft and it's very smooth. You ramp in, you ramp out. There's no sharp edges, but it's subtle. It's there. So again, it's kind of your choice on how proud you want that to be. Okay. That being said, getting into the process of doing it, there are people out there who say, well, first off, what you have to do is you make a stick that is the dimension that you want. So this is a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch stick of ebony. I'll pre-make these guys and have them just in a box. I've got 3/16, 1/4, 5/16, 3/8, and they're actually not milled to exactly 1/4 by 1/4. They're all in all cases they're about 10 to 15 thousandths of an inch larger than the dimension that you're talking about. So the 1/4 by 1/4 is going to be about 10 to 12 to 15 thousandths over a 1/4 inch. 5/16 is the same thing. And the reason for that is ebony is extremely dense and hard. And it's typically being put into Greene and Greene board and Greene and Greene world. It's mahogany, which is much softer. It's a hardwood still, but it's a softer wood by far than ebony. So making the ebony slightly larger means that it's going to wedge its way in and give you very, very crisp, clean fit around all 4 edges. And yet the mahogany is soft enough that it'll allow that to happen. It can be forced and not split. If you're using a harder wood, if your furniture is being built out of white oak or something, that's much harder. It's less forgiving. It's less ability to absorb. So I would mill the ebony to more like 5 thousandths over the dimension, because that oak is not going to give much. And if you try and force too big a peg into too small a hole on a hard brittle wood, it'll end up splitting on you. So gauge your dimension that way. So now that you've got the stick, you need to round off the end. There are people who have said, hey, quick and easy way, just put it in the drill. And all I had to do is put it down on the sandpaper and let her roll, and it'll round it off. Well, it will, but if you watch, if you can see, you get down there a little bit. See how much it wants to wander around and wobble? It just, you get very inconsistent rounding for one thing. And what also ends up happening, let's say you've gone all the way through that process and you've gone up through the grits of sandpaper. When you round it that way, what happens is the ebony is sitting at an angle and the corners of the square get knocked off as it spins around. And that ends up making, on the face of it, then you have an arc that goes from corner to corner. And on the next side, you've got an arc that goes corner to corner. So what that actually gives you is each of the corners is drawn down, but not in the middle. And that's a little hard to describe, but this can kind of give you the idea. This is an oversized peg that was done that way. You can see how the corners are down, they're drawn down, but there's this flat arch still in the middle. That's what you get if you sand using a drill bit or a drill to spin it. And of course you got 2 choices to make then if you make them that way. One is you tap it into the hole until the corners are flush with the rest of the furniture piece, but then you've got this flat that's visible on all 4 sides. Okay, the alternative is tap it in farther until the top of that arch is flush, but then the corners are all diving down into a hole because the rounding wrapped down at the quarters. So what we really want to have is I'm going the wrong way. I could think of. Yep, I was the right way. You want it to be in contact all the way across down here, right? Instead of corners down or sides up. So how do I do that? Starting point is a soft pad. I've got a bag here that's miscellaneous things that are old mouse pads, routing, backer pads, all different kinds of things you can use. But bottom line is something about 1/8 to 3/16 thick, soft, something with a little bit of give. And I'll use 150 grit, 220, and 400 grit is going to give me almost everything that I'll deal with. So I'm going to, the first shaping I'm going to do is going to be with 150 grit. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to make contact going that way and this way. It's just kind of takeoffs and landings. Okay, and the amount of pressure you put down will change how aggressive it is. And I count my strokes when if I sit down to make 40 or 60 buttons for a couple of tables at a time. It's crazy, but you start up and I get to the point where I know on 150, I'm going to be taking 20 passes each. And then I'm taking 15 on the next grit and I'm taking 10 on the next grit. But on another day, it could be totally different because the pressure I'm putting down is different. But the bottom line is that I'm making a pass where if you watch the top of this pencil, when I go this way, I want to go the same angle the other direction. I want to try and stay as consistent as I can on that starting and stopping. So I'm swiping it, and I'm swiping it, I'm swiping it, and I'm swiping it. If I go over farther on one side, I'm going to be rounding over more. If I go less, it's going to be not taking much off the edge. So try to be as consistent as you can on your strokes back and forth. But again, what this does is that sands evenly across the corners, not down the corners like the spinning action does. So the initial run, and again, is I'll do this with 150 grit usually to start with. And what I'm looking for is I want to, if you look at it after you make a few strokes, you're going to find that right in the center is a flat spot. And what you're trying to do is eliminate the flat spot. You want to round it from one edge all the way over the top to the other edge. And that should eliminate the flat spot in the middle. And I'll stay on that coarsest grit until that flat spot is gone. After that, as you go up through the other grits, all you're doing is removing the scratches from the previous sandpaper. Not shaping anymore. You've already got the shape determined. So that first grit is where you decide how proud do I want my buttons to be, or how flat do I want them to be? And then you try to maintain that consistent shape. Yeah, question.
You spin it 100.
I rotate. Yeah, I'll do the stroking back and forth, and then rotate it 90 degrees and do the other two. Yeah, and I always there's one button on this end, there's one on the other. So if I'm making a bunch of them, I'll try to mill up extra sticks. So I might have 4 sticks. That means I can make 8 at a time before I go to the next step. But I'll do both ends of this on 150, and then I'll go both ends on 220, and then I'll go to 400. When I started working with Daryl, we started, well, we on larger size buttons like 3/8 or 7/16 or 1/2 inch, you need to go down like to 80 grit. But even on 3/8, I still use 150 as my starting point. It's aggressive enough to start. But and I think Daryl actually still to this day does go on up from 400 to 600 grit, and then to a buffing wheel, a linen buffing wheel with white rouge to polish it. Over the years, I've just kind of kept thinking, that thing has a glass shine to it when it comes off that buffer. And yet, when the finish is put on it, which is a satin, more matte and almost dead flat, all that shine is gone. The shine on the end of the ebony is the same as the sheen that you put on the flat surface. And I have in the last couple of years just finally changed, and I'll stop at 400. And actually, this is my final grit. Just a piece of old blue jeans denim. There's a good abrasiveness there, and I'll just use that on my little pad as my buffer. And that what I end up with after that is a very, very clear, clean, scratch-free surface that, yes, it's a little bit lower in luster than white rouge on a buffing wheel, but when I put a satin or matte finish on the piece, it looks exactly the same, and it saves a lot of extra steps. So that's just me. But that process works really well for me. So the next thing you end up having to do then is you need to, so you got both ends pillowed the way you want them. Now we need to cut them to length. I have just kind of standardized on a 1/4 inch length for all the different sizes, and that works great because, well, here, let me show you. Here's a miniature version, or sorry, I should say a large version of what I'm going for when I'm making buttons. So again, from corner to corner, it's a straight line across, and it continues around. That's one thing you need to be be careful of. Make sure that how far you draw the line down on this in this dimension is the same as in the other way. So you literally can follow that straight line all the way around. But what you end up doing then is you end up cutting with a chisel. You cut a bevel on the bottom of the button so that you can drop it into the hole and it self-centers, and you're only gluing right up at the surface. So you don't need very much of a shoulder. And when I make my buttons at a 1/4 of an inch deep, I end up with a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch of this flat glue surface, and that's more than enough. Again, it's wedged tightly into the hole, so it doesn't need a lot of glue. But so we're going to cut to length, and I went back and forth a long time with putting a pencil mark down on my little. This is just a little crosscut sled. It's just a block that's set at 90 degrees, and I'll use a little Dozuki saw. But if you put a pencil mark for whatever length you want it to be, got a cut in there that just makes that nice clean cut for you. I ended up changing to where since I standardized on a 1/4 of an inch, I attached a stop block, a 1/16 of an inch out, or I'm sorry, a 1/4 of an inch out. You can see where the saw mark is. So all I have to do is butt that ebony up against it, the stop block, and there's my 1/4 inch peg. Okay, so it's at this stage, one face is pillowed. The length is already cut. Now I need to put that bevel on, and the way I do that is ebony is really, really hard. I don't know if you can lower down or not. So it's a little difficult to get the edge of the chisel to lock into the ebony and not slide down it. But what I finally noticed when I was doing a bunch of these was the thickness of my chisel is about puts it at the right height if I'm at a certain angle. So I'm going to hold the button with my thumb, and my chisel is almost down flat. I can just slide up against it, I'm pressing in against the ebony, bring it up to about a 45-degree angle, and press down, and it'll cut that little, rotate it 90 degrees, press into the ebony, up to 45, slice. And what that does for me, since I'm using the same registration point of the back of my chisel being down flat, then you're not going to be able to see this in the camera, but trust me, it looks like this. this is what you get, because the chisel is always hitting that same height up on each side of the button. That's important to be as close to the same level all the way around as you can, because then when you drop it into the hole, the peg will want to go straight down in rather than hanging up on one side and wanting to dive in and go crooked, because that can be problematic to try and straighten it out. And this may sound extremely precise, but it's not. When you do a bunch of these, you get pretty consistent and pretty precise at it, and you'll notice the difference when you start putting them in. Okay, so then we need a hole to put it in. Okay, so when I started working with Daryl, it's been 15, 16 years ago, he was using hollow chisel mortiser chisels without the drill bit, because that was a very similar to this in design. There's 4 pointed corners that go down, and there would be a drill bit that would go down the middle of it. They only made them, the smallest size they made was 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch. So he used those for 1/4 inch, for 5/16, for 3/8. But we did a lot of 3/16 and 1/8 inch. So it ended up, between the two of us, we ended up putting together, with the help of a couple of machinists, local machinists that were in some of our classes, some prototypes, and then contacted Lee Valley. And Veritas, the manufacturing arm of Lee Valley, will take your ideas and evaluate them. And if they put them into action, they'll pay you a royalty for those. And so they ended up building these based on Daryl's design. So we now can buy these in 3/16, 1/4 inch, 5/16, 3/8, 7/16. There's 1/2. It stops at 7/16. But this is really a sweet way to go. So what I do with mine is I'll set a drill bit in. Let's see, can you see that? So that it's the tip of the drill bit is about 3/8 of an inch from the bottom of that arch. You see how there's that curve from point to point. So I'm protruding beyond that by about 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so now what I'm actually doing is I'm going to take this to my drill. I'm going to tighten it up in the chuck, so that I still have that same amount of protrusion. So now when I put this chisel on the surface of the wood and I drill through it, it's going to go through the chisel 3/8 of an inch. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the drill out, drive the chisel in 3/8 of an inch, then go back in with the drill, hit the bottom, and that pulls all of the sawdust out of that hole in the middle. So when I pull it out, I've got a clean, square, empty hole for the plug to go into. Let me show you how that looks. I've marked, put a pencil mark here, which I'm going to call my center line for my where I want my peg to go. And this is just one of those process things that I kind of about. I don't want to have to change hands. When I grab a hold of this chisel, I want to not have to switch to my other hand. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to operate the drill with my right hand. That means I'm going to hold the chisel with my left hand. So that means I'm going to have to hold the square that I'm going to use to line it up with my right hand. Does that make sense? That's a lot. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I've got my chisel or my square lined up to where I've set the depth of the square. So that's going to set how far in the square peg is going to be. That's determined by that setback on the square. There's a groove on the blade of this square that I'm using as the center line. So I'm going to line up. I want to turn a little bit here. So I'm going to center my square punch. Now I just set that down, and I didn't do what I should always do. Everything's sitting there. Okay. Need a hammer too, so I'm going to start over. I need hammer and drill, and then the square. So there's where it's going to go. And I only have to hammer that in far enough that those four corners, those four sharp little corners on the punch, they are seated all the way around. So that basically scores the square hole. So there's not going to be any fiber tearing now. Okay, so now I can go in. I haven't let go of this thing. So I'm going to drill until the chuck hits the top of the chisel. So that sets my depth. Okay, take that out. Now the hammer, I drive it down. Now what that did was, remember, there's a hole in the center of the punch. There's a taper on the inside of there as well. So when the hammer drives down, it pushes all of the wood into that hole in the chisel. So I'm just going to go back now and clean out the hole. So that took what was jammed into the hole and pull it out. So there is a square to the edge, and emptied out, cleaned out hole. No dust to pick out, nothing. There are some people have gone about this and said, let's just say, drill the hole first where you want it to be. Then take the bit out, stick it in the hole, put the chisel over the top of it, square it that way, and pull the bit out. See, now the bit doesn't want to cooperate, and then drive it in. I just personally find it much easier to do it setting the punch first, because that is the most critical thing. Is that, trust me, when you're doing a square peg within 1/8 of an inch or 3/16 of an inch of a straight edged leg, if this thing is turned at all out of square, it's going to stand out like a sore thumb. So for me, I prioritize getting that guy square first, and 1 or 2 taps of the hammer locks it in place. Then the drilling is just emptying out the hole. Okay, any questions on that one? It's one that you need to do a few of, and you need to make a mistake every once in a while and have it twist a little bit. But that process is very simple. I think actually on the Lee Valley website, I think they have a little video on doing this. That's the old way that Daryl used to do them, drilling the hole first. One other thing, just to be sure of too, is they also had on their instructions to use a brad point bit. And I'll give them a point for, yes, a brad point if you're going to drill the hole first. Then a brad point bit is helpful to have because you get a clean hole. You don't get fiber tear out. But if you're going to drive the punch in first, what happens is this chisel is actually made in 2 parts. From this end of it is soft steel because you're pounding on it and it needs to be malleable. So it gives. The front portion is the part you have to sharpen and keep sharp. That's a much harder steel. If you made the whole thing out of the hard steel, it would be so brittle that after 5 or 6 times of hitting it with a hammer, it'd chip and break. If you made the whole thing out of the soft steel, you'd never be able to keep the points sharp. So it's two pieces that are screwed together. At that point where they screw together, there's a larger diameter hole in the soft portion of it and a smaller diameter hole at the bottom. So if you put a brad point bit into this, you're fine until those two little ears on the ends of the brad point bit get to that transition spot where it's all of a sudden the hole gets smaller, and those little brad ears are going to get knocked off and your bit is toast. So use a standard twist drill if you're going to use the process of punching, setting the punch first and then drilling. If you're going to go to drill first, then you could use a brad point, because you don't ever put it into the chisel except just to slide it on and locate it. So you wouldn't damage it in that scenario.
What size bit to use for that?
The bit is and it'll show you at Lee Valley, 3/64 of an inch smaller than the size of the square. Yeah, and they're pretty easy to find. There's one size, the 1/4 inch, the standard jobber's length, which is what you find in most hardware stores, for 1/4 inch is too short to do this little exercise of extend it beyond and then put it into the chuck of your drill. So you need to buy a longer length one and cut it down, but not a big hassle.
George, I've got a question or a comment, actually.
Sure.
Can you go over just real briefly on what you do when your bit is too long? And I'm talking about the collar, the bit stop. You know what I'm talking about?
Not sure. No, it's a bit.
You've drilled a piece of MDF with a hole in it, and you slide it over your bit. Yeah.
You're using that as a stop.
Yeah.
Okay, but first choice would be, if you can eliminate that piece and do like this, where you're actually setting you need different brands and sizes of chucks give you more or less ability to bury the bit in there. Some will only take a 1/2 inch in. Some will go 1.25 inches in. So the more it allows you, then the more flexibility you've got. But the general rule for me is if I have my bit 3/8 of an inch out beyond the punch, if I have left back here on the shaft, if I have 3/4 of an inch, even 1/2 inch,
you're good
to get into the chuck, that's good.
Okay.
There's not a lot of pressure here, and you're only drilling a hole 3/8 of an inch in. So there's not a big deal. But like I said, if this, and I'm sure it was a 1/4 inch, where there's not enough there.
Yeah.
So then you have to get one that's got 2 inches too much. Well, then you just cut it down so that you end up with a 1 inch stub here or whatever that will fit into your chuck, and you go from there. Because having the end of the chuck be your stop collar is much more solid and consistent long term for you than if you have a piece of wood on there.
Got it.
It can move, it can get hung up. I mean, that's a good way to do it, but if you can eliminate a moving part, you're that much closer to consistency.
Understood.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything else.
I like that, the little tip of putting the drilling a second time once you've pounded. Yeah, I've always used a chisel to chisel kind of that stuff out, and leaves a bit of a mess. Yeah.
We were going through, I mean, I was going around to dentists' offices and asking for broken picks. And actually, we had a number of dentists in classes that we were teaching, and every time there was a dentist, we'd say, oh, what do you do with your broken picks? Because usually they're double enders, and if one end breaks, they trash them. And so we'd have dentists that be saving up Ziploc bags full of these things, because those are great to get in and fish stuff out.
Yeah.
And until we came up with why not just put the same drill bit back in that same hole, and it'll pull it all out. So we got all these dental picks now that we don't have these.
You don't know what to do it.
But I mean, there are other times when I use those picks actually for other things, but so they're handy for that because it's a real hard steel and real sharp points, and it'll get you into some real tight places, much more so than and I've got a little 1/8 inch, 10th inch bench chisel. And yet there are some places it can't get into either. So the pick does the trick on those.
Big hardware sales, Harbor Freight sells them.
Yeah, there are a lot of places that sell the picks. Yeah, and what you find if you go to a hardware store variety of those picks, they're much bulkier, they're heavier, so they don't get into as tight of places. But they're better than nothing for sure. Okay, I just should have maybe something in setting the buttons in. And again, I did mention, I go back to the hole and I'll just use a toothpick. I'll put a dab of glue on a scrap board and I'll use a toothpick, just get just a drop on it. And I'll go just around the top edge of the hole. And then when you set this button down in there, it'll pull the glue down with it and coat that shoulder face of it as you go in. This is the standard hammer that works really well for doing this. It's a Stanley. You find those in a lot of places. This is the hard plastic. I know a lot of guys that went and bought the Harbor Freight one that's got rubber on one end, and then it's got a soft plastic. But in both of them they're rubber. They bounce back. This is a hard plastic, so it has some forgiveness in terms of it won't damage the surface of your button if you polished it to a real high shine, but it does have a solid bite that it transfers the force directly into the button, sends them down. This is one I found at a garage sale. It's a bronze head, but you can see it's smaller, so the head it's easier to. I find it easier to hold on to a button to get it in place and still be able to get the hammerhead to it. This is very, very common. You can find it in a lot of places, and this works almost as well. So,
George, before you move on, Keith's got a quick question. Keith, you want to go ahead and just verbally ask?
You might need to unmute, Keith.
I did, yeah, I just found it.
Okay.
George, when you set the button in there, have you ever used any kind of like collar to go around the button so that you don't overset the depth? I tried that once and it was such a pain in the butt. I just
it is, and what ends up happening is one of two things. It is a spacer, and it will not let you set the button so that the edges are down flush with the surface. It'll always keep them up a little bit, and you run your hand across there, your finger across there, you're going to feel a little bit of a sharp edge on all four sides because it's being held up. So if you're going to use that to kind of get it down and then take that off and tap it a little bit more to get it down, what did you save by having it there to start with? The other thing is that I know a lot of people who have found that, and what they would typically use is the metal or plastic shims that some of us get when you buy a dado stack. And the problem is that a lot of people experienced was that they used flat plugs, and the hammer ever hit that inside small diameter hole, it left a circle indent around the square hole.
Yeah, that's what I found when I tried to mess around with it.
Yeah.
Speeding the process up, right? Didn't work.
Yeah, you think you're speeding it up, but really what it amounts to is you need to just develop. And this is why whenever the day I'm going to be putting buttons in, I start out with just a chunk of scrap. And I always make extra buttons, and I'll just pick through and I'll take all the best ones, and they'll always be, 6 out of 40 are, they're not quite level, not quite as flat or whatever. So they're the lowest grade. I'll use those, and I'll just punch 6 holes and just set them, and just to get the rhythm. How strong am I feeling today? How wimpy am I today? And how accurate am I at hitting the top dead center on that button so it goes straight down? you can steer them to some extent by tapping on one edge or the other. If you find that it's going in a little bit stronger on one side, it's tough though. You really want to stay on looking at it and making sure it stays pretty close to level. If it gets a little bit too far, you're never going to get it back out again, or you'll never get it to level out. And the other thing that I found too is don't stop and wait very long, because that glue, tight bond 1 is starting to set up right quickly. And this is a tight fit too. So if you stop and wait for 10 seconds and you now want to decide you want to make it go in a little bit farther, you're not going to be able to do it, because it's all that glue is going to grab it and it won't go anymore. So you're going to start tapping harder and harder. Then it's going to go, and it'll go way below the surface. So once you get it moving, keep it moving and until you get within that margin of error. And they're not going to all be 100% exact, but determine how close you are going to consider close. And when you get there, stop. Don't say one more tap, because that's the one that pushes me over the edge. So
Yeah, and taking out buttons is no fun.
it's not. I've only had to do it on 2 of them, but they were both scary. It was, and the best thing I found to do it actually is take a center punch and tap a little right in the center of the button, so you get just a little bit of a dimple, and then use a brad point bit that's just a little bit smaller in diameter than the size of the peg. And as long as you've hit that center with that dimple, then you'll end up, when you drill through it, there'll be a very thin wall on the if this is the hole, right at that center point on the straight line. There's very, very little material there. So you usually can go in with a small chisel and just crack it there, crack it on the opposite side, and then you're just pulling those pieces out. So it's going to happen to everybody. I mean, it's practice though. Practice will make the difference. And it's like I said, some days I just have more. I have more power in my swing. Sometimes I don't. So, okay. So let's move on to the breadboard splines. And so this is the piece we're talking about now. So it's the spline that transitions the breadboard to the core of your top. And of course, that has a shape to it because there's a transition. The breadboard end overhangs the core of the top by about 3/16 of an inch. So the spline is gonna make a step. It has to jog out 3/16 of an inch in order to stay protruding the same amount out here as it is back here. So that is the shape that it has to be. There's 3/16 of an inch step down from here to here. Okay. The way I first learned to do these was with one of these, a slot cutter bit. And what was involved with that then was using pencil marks on each end of where you want the slot to go. And okay, one thing I should point out here now, on our breadboard tops, the bottom, it's flush on the bottom, but there's an 1/8 of an inch difference here on the top. So if I want to run a router bit to make a straight cut here, I have to be referencing off the bottom here. So I'm always working at the bottom up. So now my router is sitting on top, but I have to manually plunge in at the right point, get across and pull it out at the right point to have that length using a slot cutter. When I'm going in this direction, okay, the bit is turning this way. So I'm going with the grain in the core, and I'm going across the grain in the breadboard end. So I'm fine there. But when I go to the other side of that breadboard, okay, here I'm going across the grain on the breadboard end part. But as this guy is rotating this way in the core, when I get to my stopping point out here, that cutter is wanting to pull up and tear out this fiber. So when I've gotten into trouble of gluing up a solid body, doing all the punching all the mortises and everything else that goes into the shaping and everything on this breadboard end, if I'm plowing along here and this guy chips out, blows out big time, I got a lot of work that I have to redo. And yet I did a lot of them this way, and I only had a couple of small repairs that I had to do, but nonetheless, any one of them is enough. So we started brainstorming on other ways to do it. And the answer was, instead of cutting horizontally to make that cut, why don't we cut vertically with our outer bit? And so this jig was born, which again looks a lot like that mortising jig we used in the previous session. And it's just got space in between to accommodate the body of the top. That's what the thickness is here. But as you remember, there's a step up when you get to the breadboard end. So how do we keep this surface flat? Well, the way we do that is by having this little notch. When you build this guy, what you basically can do is have this be all flat, and from this point back, add on a piece that's 3/16 of an inch thick, which is what that offset is then. So what that allows then is, you can see through there. So the body, this portion is registering flat on the top of the body of my top. And yet there's 3/16 of an inch room so that this end is also there. So this platform is parallel to both of these edges. Okay. So when we in use, what we do is we set it on, we make sure we push it up so that the shoulder is against that raised breadboard end. Back up. So first thing is clamp the top into a vise. Then when you set this guy on, slide it into place, and then you can throw a clamp on the back side here that pinches the tabletop between those two runners, so it's locked in place. Okay. So then we're using the plunge router with this isn't the right size bit, but so again, it's the plunge router with that template collar. Fits nicely in there. It's got a start and a stop point. And we're using, in this case, we're using a 5/16 spiral upcut plunge bit. So we're gonna plunge in 1/8 of an inch or so, run up to the end, plunge it down another 1/8 of an inch, back, down 1/8 of an inch, back until you bottom out. And we set the depth. We set the depth the same way using the stop collar or the turret on the side, where you can set this guy. This is going to get kind of convoluted. we want the depth of the mortise to be this depth right here. That's the narrow end. So I can have one of these made up, or you just, if you have the jig, you're going to have this depth in known. You can set that right on the turret and then set the stop down to it. Then when you plunge, it'll stop when you get your mortise that deep. Does that make sense? So that'll give you, without any risk of tear out, that'll give you a mortise with rounded corners on each end. This ebony piece that's going to go in has squared corners, so we need to square this up. We used to have to go in with a chisel and extend the straight line out there, extend the straight line, try and get perfectly square down across the end. Then I got thinking, well, we've got these square chisels. Why not use that? And you can just drop two of the points down inside, bring the other ones up right to the end. So setting the bottom two ears of the chisel or the punch down in the mortise and then tipping it straight up. A little bit of cleanup, and now we got a nice squared end. Do the same thing on the other end. Okay. Questions on that one? I'm going to go from here to shaping the actual ebony piece that goes in here.
George, to add on to what you're saying, you know, that the slot cutter, that's what I first started with, one of my first nightstand. And I think I told you this story, but I had all three corners done, going to the fourth one, and then the router decided to run away. Yeah. And it plowed a groove 3/4 of the way down the whole table. And I had to put in a very large spline after that point, once I had vocabulary enhancement exercises.
Yeah, that happens. Yeah, I think I saw the picture there where you basically made the spline run the full length of the top. Yeah. There are other ways. There's always several ways you can try and address it, but that's a reality. That's always a possibility, and it's like I said, it's not a step that you can do before you glue the parts together. It needs to be assembled, and those pieces need the core and the breadboard end need to be locked in place before you do this operation. So if it goes sideways, you don't have a lot of latitude. And the alternative whole top, and that's not a fun proposition. So this scenario with going vertical and plunging it, it's really all we're doing there is literally making a mortise, just like the mortise and tenon joiner we did to put the legs, attach the legs to the apron. So it's very, very straightforward that way. Okay, so if there's not anything more, I will shift off to the ebony side. I'll give you a quick rundown of how we used to do it, and it did work. But what we did after using the slot cutter was we would cut a blank of ebony that is a little over in dimension to accommodate the shape of what we're going for here. And we actually would, after squaring up the ends on this guy from the slot cutter, we would cut this piece to length and glue it in there. At that point, we had to do it this way. It had to be a snug fit to start with. So you really couldn't put it in and run a pencil mark on there to have a line to cut to, make a relief cut and come out. You had one shot, so you had to put it in. Then we would use a flush trim bit, something, 1-inch diameter spiral cutter, and we would set it up on the registering on the bottom. We will be running a flush trim bit. We start up here on the top at the breadboard end, and the bearing would roll over that 3/16 step and then plow away the material on the bottom side too. So that would be, we would use, actually the way we would do that is we would change the bearing to an oversized bearing, slightly larger. So that would make it so that the bit, instead of trimming it flush, it would trim it parallel to the surface that the bearing is riding on, but it would leave a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch, depending on what size bearing you put on it. So at that point, we had a piece of ebony in the slot with the right contoured shape, but the top edges were square. And the whole idea of this is in Greene and Greene is to soften all the edges, not have the hard, crisp, sharp lines. It's all pillowed and rounded over and soft to the touch. So what you'd have to do then is mask off everything around the ebony so that you could go back in and hand sand to put a shape to it. And that somebody was making a comment earlier on the call about how fine that ebony dust is. And man, African mahogany, which is what we were using when I was first starting working with Daryl, is very, very open pored, large pored. And this ebony dust would get into those pores, something fierce, and it was with a bear to get it out of there. And it didn't matter how much masking tape you put on there or what kind of tape you used. You always got some in there that was problematic. When you went to do the staining and the finishing, there was like a dark halo around the ebony splines because that wood had absorbed some of that ebony dust. So we ended up looking at other ways to skin that cat and came up with this one. And this is probably a 6th generation now, I think. But this is a jig with the shape. So this has got that same step down shape, that 3/16 difference for the upper part that's in the breadboard end down to the lower part, which is where the body of the top is. But what this is a sandwich with springs inside of it, actually. It's on the way. So your ebony piece goes into the jig in the middle, registered against the end, and then by tightening the knobs, I loosened it way up so I can show you the spring action. But so this will pinch the ebony in. So that's now held in place on the jig between the two pieces. All right. And what we'll do is we'll run a pencil line on that. Pencil line on, we can take it over to the bandsaw and make a relief cut on it. So there's not all that much left to have to take off. And then what we're doing is we're gonna do two things at one time. We're gonna actually route that. We're gonna route this shape onto it. But we're also going to put a fingernail rounding on the top edge of it at the same time. And that's using a fingernail bit. So it's not a bullnose bit, but the bullnose bit would be a half of a circle. So this is just a portion of a circle. And I think this was actually a 7/8 inch radius on this one. Okay. So it'll put this radius on that top edge, and it'll shape the cloud lift there. So here's how it fits in there. The ball bearing rides against the pattern on the top. And the curved cutter follows that pattern and puts the shape. So you can see what was cut on the end of the jig is what happens to that's the shape that gets put onto the top edge of the ebony. So at that point, we just used 220 grit and 40 grit, 400 grit paper on this top edge when it comes out of the jig, just to take any chatter marks out of it. And it gets put into that mortise and it's done. There's no sanding in place to get all that dust into the mahogany or anything like that. It all gets finished, sanded to the finished level before it even gets put in. Okay. That's a huge time saver and huge work improvement. I mean, it makes the result so much better. Daryl sells parts for all of these jigs. He's got kits for each one of these jigs you can buy from and little instruction sheets and stuff, and you put them together yourself. I can get those for you too, and we can put them together in my shop. And I'll run you through them if you want to do that, anybody. One other thing that I need to tell you about what's related to these, and that has to do with wood movement. And we'll do it over here. So if you were looking into there, okay, you're going to see there's a spline right at the junction point between the breadboard end and the core. It spans a ½ inch into each side. I think you can see it in there right under my finger. Okay, so that's that transition zone. When this tabletop gets in a high humidity or low humidity situation, if it's high humidity, this part wants to expand this way. And when it dries out, it's going to want to shrink up. The breadboard end, the purpose of this is to be running 90 degrees to that grain, so it can keep this big wide body flat. And as long as we attach it in the middle and leave it ability to move at the ends, it'll accommodate movement here. But we take another piece of material and put it in there, and it stretches between the two of them. And let's look at this one. Okay, with this one where it's straight on the bottom, if we put this one in that slot and it went all the way down to the bottom, and that's where it wants to go, okay, what's going to happen? What's going to happen when this body shrinks? If there's glue along the whole surface in the mortise, if this is glued all the way across, this side can move and it'll shrink. This will not. So this is going to break. Bottom line, it's glued. It's locked in here and it's locked in here, but this side is going to shrink or expand. So you have to let this part move in the slot. So we don't put any glue at this point. Anywhere in the breadboard end, there can be no glue in the breadboard end because it's going to stay stable. It's not going to move. Everything that way can and will shrink and move to some extent over time. So that's where you want the glue to go when you put this in there. Okay, so now you've solved that won't break because of being locked in with glue on both sides of that joint. But it's still going to move. If you're provided a means for it to slide in there, that's good. But still, when it shrinks, the mortise in the bottom here is the same depth all the way across. So if this side shrinks, this is going to move with it. And okay, the fact that there's no glue here means it can slide, but there's a shoulder down there that is trying to push against as it shrinks. So you have what you have to do is make a little relief cut on the bottom. Okay, so that's going to be in there roughly like that. Okay, so now if the body shrinks, there's this much room. You can shrink, as long as it doesn't shrink more than that, there's room for this to go in or come out. Does that make sense? There's another way you can deal with it, and that would be to route the mortise in this area about that much deeper than over here. That would provide room for this, for the body to move and not break this loose, as well as this part doing this. It's a lot, I know. Questions? And the amount here is not really a big rocket science kind of thing. Based on the size of the top, I mean, the overall width, you can calculate how much it might maximum go from really bone dry to really wet. How much might it move for worst case basis? And that's the depth that you want to make this little notch.
George,
Okay.
Keith had a question about the bit, the fingernail bit.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, do you
Fire
have
away.
a model number for that
Yeah,
bit, George?
I do. It is an Amana 51586. They call it a convex edging bit with ball bearing. There are, and they're, I don't remember now how much they are. There's, I found Woodline in Tennessee used to have one very similar to this. I think this is like a $50, $60 bit. Woodline had one for a while that they sold for 24 or something, and then they got behind on with back orders, and they just, I think they just stopped making it. But
And that one's a white side, is that what you said?
no, it's Amana. Amana.
Amanda, okay.
White side does not make one like this at all. They make bullnose bits, but that puts too severe a rounding on it.
Yeah,
Yeah, but this is the best deal. And we can, if you're going to be making a trip over this side of the mountains, like you were talking about a while back,
right.
and you want to stop by, we can just run your Ebony on my jig with this bit on my router table, and you can take them home and just do the finishing touches on them.
Okay.
That's open to anybody. Okay. Okay, if we're good there. Last chance. Anybody? Okay. I'll just do one other little quick one in terms of other applications of Ebony. On the breadboard ends, we do a bar in the middle typically, and this is the area again where this is where we put the glue between the breadboard and the core, and we put the screws out here at the ends, so it'll allow some movement. When I cut these mortises, I just do them on my hollow chisel mortiser, so you can see what the pattern looks like there. We're moving the chisel over for sequential boring. And then the jig for the template actually has a space off on this end where you can put bar stock, and there's no lift on that one, so they're just straight across. So that's where I'll do the bars. Will be in here, so I get that pillowing the same amount and everything. So I'll just do a long bar and then just cut them the length. Okay. Block and dowel pulls. And just to refresh everybody, this is This is what we call a block and dowel pull. It actually, the original design, I think, actually came from Prinoff. Prinoff had a piece where he did something. It wasn't identical. It was very, very close to this. So it's basically just two blocks with a hole in it, pull through them, and a dowel, piece of dowel rod in there, which seems simple enough. And it can be. But, over the course of time, different sizes, pieces of furniture, lots of variations there on size and shape and how heavy the dowel is compared to the block. So basically, we're starting out with a piece of material that you make your own choice on what diameter rod do you want to have and how large or bulky or light you want the block to be. You can also change. There's no science to this as to how high it needs to be. Some of these you'll find are actually there's not a lot of room to get your fingers behind them because the block, the hole in the block is actually down fairly low. So you might want to make your blocks higher if you've got larger fingers and you want to really get behind. Generally speaking, these are used on smallish pieces like nightstands or end tables where there's not going to be a lot of bulk in a drawer. So really it's kind of it's a thumb and two fingers pull kind of thing. It's not like you have to get your hand around it to pull a heavy drawer out, but you can play with that as you want to do it. But the way I go about it is I'll mill up a piece of stock to the dimension, then I run a round over on the two top edges, do that while it's still in stick form. Now I'm just cutting the length. And at that point then I've got pieces this long. I'll round over with the rest of the edges at this point. Then I've got to drill a hole in them. And that needs to be straight and it needs to be square, because if it's not, and you put those two together on a dowel, they're going to be not sitting flat and flush on your drawer front. So what I do, this doesn't take long to build, but this is just a little jig to take to the drill press. So I'll clamp this down on the drill press. The block piece fits right into the little notch, so it can't spin and twist on me, and I don't have to hold it tight. I don't have to hold it straight. I made that cut on the table saw, so I know it's dead straight and square. So that's perfectly vertical. So I just then line up my center point on the drill bit, clamp this guy down, and now I can do block after block, and it'll always be in the same place. And the idea being you want to get that hole centered so you've got an even spacing on the sides and the top. That's centrally located in there. Okay. And you got to play a little bit with this stuff for those of you who have done some stuff with dowels. Diameter on dowels is not consistent. I mean, you can go to any shop, any woodworking store, any place, and pull 10 sticks of the same piece out, and you're going to have at least 5 different diameters. So I tend to err on the big side. But if I'm usually using 3/8 dowel stock, and I usually drill a 3/8 hole. Almost always the dowel stock is not round, and in one dimension it's over 3/8. So there's a wedge capability. There's some friction there where it'll bite. And if anything, I want the dowel to be bigger than the hole, and then you have to sand it to make it smaller. And I think we had a discussion on this on the chat line at one point, but What I have found works really well for me is I would chuck this into the drill press and then take sandpaper and just as it was spinning at a relatively low speed. But you just try and uniformly work it up and down to try and take a light touch off of it. The problem with that ends up being that where you clamp it into the chuck, it gets all boogered up in that portion of it. So you need to have it oversized in length so you can cut that off. Well, I ended up finding this, it's just plastic hose. It's a aquarium hose or whatever. You cut a chunk of that and slip it onto the end of the dowel piece. Now you can chuck that thing tight as you want in there, and it'll grip it better, and it stays straight and it won't bugger it up. So that's one little shortcut. And then, so now you're talking about trying to glue it together. And so you got a little problem to deal with here in that you want to have even spacing out here on the end on all of them. And so to start with, we kind of did this little routine where we drilled a hole in 2 blocks, the same depth, and the depth of that hole represents the amount of overhang we wanted. So what we would do is put one of these on each end. And as you slide those blocks out against the dowels, they're going to be equally spaced. Of course, there's going to be glue in there at the time you're trying to do this moving. And that got a bit problematic. So I ended up, this was another one to fail safe, as you cut a block that fits in between and these. And that gives more consistent results. But the better way ended up being this guy, where you got your 2 blocks. All goes through. Push the dowel against this stop block, slide that one in there. So now you've got exact same spacing here, and you've got exact same spacing out there. And what ended up happening for me, which was problematic, was glue squeeze out, because I didn't want to have a giant blob of glue out here on each of the ends. If you put glue in the inside of that whole thing, and then you shove the dowel in, a lot of that glue gets pushed out the other end, and this end is totally covered. Both ends are that way. And then in the process, you've got glue squeezing out in here. So what I ended up doing was putting tape to protect it on the inside edges here. So anything that squeezes out on the inside won't stick to the dowel because there's tape on there. And what I did was I started out like this, where I'd put it in 1/2 inch first. Now I put my glue on here. So when I slide it into place, this is still clean and dry out here. You see that enough to get that one? So it's open it up, put the glue on here, put the glue on here, pull them together. And once they're set in place, pull it off, put the next one on, and away you go. All right, so now you need to attach it. So this is what you've got now at that point. You do your finishing on it, whatnot. It's the same scenario. But now the way we've always attached them is we put threaded inserts in the bottom of the blocks, and then we use a flathead brass machine screw. I'm sure you can see that. Just a standard machine screw, brass, through from the back of the drawer. But you need to get the spacing of these inserts identical, and then you need to also be able to drill holes in the drawer front that'll line up with it perfectly. So what I would do is take one of these and mark a center line on each one of those blocks, and then cut a piece of scrap. So it is exactly the same spacing as center line to center line. Okay, so now I can go to the drill press, have a fence at the drill press, and have a stop over here. Stop at this end. I set the drill bit up so that it sits right on that center point. Right on the center point of that one. Okay. Then I slide that guy over, put that spacer in between the stop block and that one. And now it's going to hit center line on here. So I can drill all of my poles just drill one end there, put the spacer in, drill the other end, one end in, the other. And you do the same thing with your drawer fronts. You set the drawer fronts up against a fence. You mark the first one off. You set this, you set the spacing for where it's going to be centered on the drawer front. Drill for that one, and using the same spacer, move the drawer front over, the spacer in, and it'll give you exactly that same spacing. And if you're up against a fence, it's going to stay parallel, so they're going to be flat, not cattywampus. Does that work? The inserts that I use are some that I found online from Pennsylvania, as it turns out. If you're putting them into mahogany or even something like sapele, that's a soft enough wood that a standard threaded insert will work most of the time. If you're doing a pole where you're using ebony for the blocks, that is so hard and brittle. If you put a standard one in and drill the pilot hole the same, it would crack them 3 times out of 4. These are really, I can get that to stay there. It's a really fine threaded, they actually call it a knife thread or a knife edge threading. It's a real thin. So it's like a chisel. It slices its way in rather than wedging its way in. So these work really slick in hardwoods like ebony, or if you're doing rosewood or cocobolo or something like that. They're not expensive. It's 20 of them for $6 or something, but they're hard to find. Then I can give you the place that has those. So I just use these for everything, rather than using one for softwoods and one for hardwoods. I just use the same one for all. Any questions there or on anything else prior?
Yeah, do you have at your disposal the source for those?
Yes. It's called Micro Fasteners. They're in Easton, Pennsylvania. Yep. $5.90 for 20 of them. And it's an 832 is the thread and size on
The
it.
knife edge, right?
Yeah, knife edge, knife thread, I think is what they call it.
Oh.
There's here the number. Here's the number. It's BTI 0832. Actually, I think it's BT1 0832.
Cool.
They're not. There's where it is. Okay. Okay, I think the last thing I was going to throw out here is pillowing fingers in Breadboard. So that's going to be trying to get that that rounding over. Taking the squareness off the fingers. The way I go about these is kind of do one quick shortcut first, and that is I'm I'm gonna take, the fingers are on the sides, they're the ones that are proud, but the fingers on the front are trimmed flush. So I'll go to the router table and route an 1/8 inch radius on the two long edges there. We also need to get in and round over these inside edges and these outside edges at one point. Those are so small and so short, that's easy to do by hand. But I run the router with a round over to get that to start with. That number one gives me a head start on knocking the corners off to get the rounding going. And number two, it gives me somewhat a line where the radius stops. That's my stop line. That's where I want to stop the rounding, because when this comes together, if I round too far down, there's going to be a little valley in here, and I don't want to have that valley in there. I want the rounding to stop at the surface of the front or a little bit above it. If it goes below, then it's going to show up as a dark line, like a miscut or misfit joint. So that edge of the roundover is my target. That's my stay away from it. Sneak up to it on the last grit of sandpaper. So otherwise, I'm going to take the size and I'll clamp them in a bench vise. And I've got a drum sander that uses 3-inch belts, 3-inch roll. And there's always a short piece left over at the end of a bulk roll, which is perfect for me to use for this. So this is 150 grit. And this is a resin backing on it. So it's pretty stiff and rigid, which means it doesn't, it's not going to wander around a lot. It's going to sand fairly straight. So I'm just doing a little shoe shine routine here. Now, you need to be careful when you do this, though, to not go down too far, because when you get down at this kind of an angle, I'll guarantee you, you're going to go down too far over the edge here, and you're going to have that valley showing. So, so I'm starting out relatively flat. I also give myself a target for the middle. I'll put a pencil mark right down the middle. So that's going to be the top of my rounding, my radius. So I'm basically going to work on, as I sand here, it starts taking off material on either side of the line over here, and eventually it'll start coming across the top, and the flat will be gone and the pencil will be gone. And then it's just, and 150 grit will do all the shaping for me. I don't need to go coarser than that. So I'm using 150, and then I'll go 220. At 220, that's where I stop on all the rest of the parts on the table. I don't go any higher than that. However, this is end grain, and end grain will always end up darker than face grain, flat grain, even if you're putting just clear finish on. A tree is a bundle of straws, and this is the end of the bundle of straws, so it sucks anything liquid you put in there big time. Far more of it than the face grain. So I always sand up to 320 or 400 on end grain, like fingers like this. What that accomplishes is actually mostly that it burnishes those pores, so they seal up, so they don't absorb, overly absorb like they would when they're all wide open. So you end up with this, still will be a little bit darker, but it'll be a lot closer to the darkness that you get on the face grain of that piece of furniture. So so again, 150 to do the shaping pretty much, 220 to smooth that out, and with 220 is where I would go do looking at my lines. If I need to pull it down just a little bit more to get close enough to the line that I'm comfortable, then I'll do that with 220, and then the 400 is just to clean it up. I do always bring my, and usually I'll make up one, at least one spare drawer front for each size drawer. even if it's just on a scrap, just to have, this much material that has the fingers on it. And actually, I'll even pare just a little bit off of the fingers so I can drop it on and off of here very quickly. And just as my double check. So I can keep checking down on these corners and make sure I'm not drawing it down too far. And I'll usually round these long edges down first. When I'm good with those, then I come back and knock down these short ones on the ends. Okay. It's far easier to do this when the pieces are separate. If you're in here doing it like with this in place, how are you going to round this down? I can round this side out here, fine. But to round that, I'm working like this. And what that ends up doing is it's sanding a little divot in the face here too. And it'll show for sure. So do the pillowing and rounding and getting the final grit good on these before you do the chair or the drawer glue up. It's the same process on the breadboard end, except it's larger. So in that case, I do oftentimes go down from 150, and I'll use 80 grit, and then do 120, and then this. And I don't have this paper. I've got it in 120, but I don't have it in 80. So what I'll just take a sheet, take a full sheet, rip it in half, take the half sheet, fold it in half. So now I've got a double layer of the 80 grit, and on the breadboard end with that guy in there, that gives enough stiffness with 2 layers there, that it gives a pretty true straight line. In worst case, when I get to the 150 level, this will straighten all of it out. Okay. This is another one of those, you need to just get in there with a piece of wood and start doing it. You'll find, especially on the breadboard end, because it's 7/8 of an inch thick. That's a lot of material to take away. And it takes a while. I mean, and you got 4 ends to do, because they're 2 breadboard ends. Each of them has 2 ends to do. That's one I usually break up. I'll do one breadboard and go do something else for a while, come back and do the other one. But it's not difficult. It's easy to get caught up in focusing on the top, that top flat part that you want to make rounded, and you lose track sometimes on how far down you're letting the paper pull, and the next thing you know, you've gone too deep. So it's going to happen on something for you, but it'll come with practice, like everything else. Okay, I skimmed over a lot of things, so I'm expecting there will be questions. I don't know. Some of you have seen some of Daryl's videos, and some of you have read the book. And a lot of this stuff is covered in those. His classes and classes that I've done, I've covered some of this stuff too. So it depends on how new people are in the group and what you remember from a while back. And, so, any questions at all on any of this, or if you want to, if there's something from the last video from the general meeting that I went too fast on or anything?
Well, I got to say one thing. I sure appreciate you figuring out all these jigs in that. It saves the rest of us an awful lot of time.
well, and they didn't happen all of a sudden. I mean,
doesn't look like it, man.
These things developed in a production shop over the course of 5-6 years.
Yeah.
And like I said, none of these are in the first edition. There have been multiple changes and restructures and redesigns to get them to here. And so, are these the final deal? Probably not.
Maybe
Although
not.
for Daryl, I think they are, because he's doing more and more on CNC now instead of the manual way. But some of the stuff is you can't do it on CNC.
Well, it's very interesting to hear your progression. Here's how we did it, and then we realized if we did it this way.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, and a lot of it was just it's like with the mortises for the breadboard splines. The technology existed for both processes back when. That wasn't anything new. It wasn't a new tool or a new bit that came out. It's just mindset. We never thought about doing it with the piece on edge.
Yeah.
It was always, well, reference off that big flat surface. Why not? That's the obvious easy thing with a big based router, you know. And I did some of those on the router table. I thought I was gonna, you know, something better than sliced bread. If I just do the thing on a router table, I can reference that flat bottom on the table, and I can get all kinds of pressure on it, keep it stable there, and not have to worry about the router tipping on the edge. But find a router table that's dead flat and stays there, and the insert might be a little bit cockeyed in there. And there were other things that came along too. But
Sure.
this is so far. I mean, there haven't been. I don't think there have been any variations on any of these jigs for about 5-6 years.
Yeah.
So they're
Certainly,
pretty-
horizontal mortiser would be one way of doing it as well. But with the jigs, you don't have to measure it all out every time. You've measured once, it's done.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
you're making 2 or 4 identical nightstands. Well, there you go. You're good.
Yeah. Horizontal mortiser could be used to do those breadboard spline mortises. You still have to go back in and square up the ends. But again, with the square punches, that's simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're getting away from using the slot cutter was a big one.
Yeah.
That eliminated a lot of risk and gave much more consistent results and took away the fear of blowing out and having to set you back 4 days and rebuilding. So
I'll second King's comment about the jigs, because I made 4 of those nightstands, as you know.
yeah,
The first 2, that jig for creating the spline wasn't available.
Yeah.
And I did 2 of them by hand, 4 splines, 8 splines, I guess it
yeah,
was.
for sure. Yeah.
And let's just say they aren't nearly as consistent as the remaining 2 nightstands.
It's a more organic.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you can tell that it's made by hand.
By hand, yeah.
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 Right.
So it's probably worth more.
Yeah. Well, it was a lot harder.
And there's nothing
And,
perfect in nature, Greg. So that's okay.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Well, then this was certainly natural.
Very natural. Yeah.
But when that right in the middle of those 4, having done 2 of them, his second book came out, and I was like, oh,
There it is.
that's the way to do it.
Yeah, yeah. Yep.
And I think, just to add in, I think that the bit that I used, I actually got at Grizzly, same kind of profile.
The convex one
Yeah.
like that. Okay.
It might not be the exact same size, but it gives you the same.
Oh, yeah.
It's not
Close enough. Yeah.
not a bullet.
They're and Amana makes that. I believe that's a 7/8 inch radius. I also have a 1 inch radius from them, and I think that was really kind of where we were going. Was we wanted it to have enough of a radius that it was a noticeable rounding,
Mhm.
and you get too large a radius and it's just barely off a flat. Well, that's not helping much. But and in looking at the real deal, I mean the authentic real Greene pieces, they did something like the flush trim and then hand sanded them too, because you could see they actually didn't take much of the flat off. It actually was more just radiused on the edges and flat on the top. So they almost had to have done it with a pattern bit and just left a little bit fat and went by hand. But
Those details make all the difference, man.
Yeah.
George Lanfear's got his hand up as well. George?
I had a question, George. If we go back to the threaded inserts,
okay.
I've tried using them on different projects over the years, and I have a problem trying to drive them straight into a hole that I've drilled. Do you have any technique for keeping those straight going in?
With these inserts, they have not been problematic. They're long and narrow, and they're fairly thin in profile. So it's pretty easy to keep them lined up, compared to some of the other ones that are chunkier. They're more round almost.
Okay.
I know people have gone to the drill press and put your piece underneath the chuck, and you chuck the driver that you're going to use into the drill press, and then you just manually rotate the chuck as you bring it down into the piece. That keeps it dead on straight 90 degrees. And I mean, what I usually use is one of these T drivers that you can buy from anybody that sells the threaded inserts. You need to get a matching stud on the end of it, for the threads that you're using. But these are still an issue. I mean, you see, I've got a washer on there. I've had some of these where it goes in there just great, but I try to back this out. The threaded insert comes with it sometimes, and I've gone to using, you know, a washer on there. Sometimes two washers. I've used fiber washers instead of steel washers, and some of them sometimes are just squirrely. I don't know what it is, but the best thing has been just putting a lubricant on the threads on the wrench, and that usually, you know, WD-40 or something on there. I don't want to put much on there because I don't want any of that to wick into the wood, because then I've got finishing problems. But just a light wiping on the threads occasionally helps that come back out. But if you, and I know a lot of guys will just take a piece of threaded rod the size of the threading in the insert and put a nut, 2 nuts on it to lock it. Then you could put that chunk of threaded insert into your drill press chuck and use that as the driver. Or you could buy one of these and cut the handle off, then you've got the same thing. But you just need a shoulder and the threading the same on the inside.
Okay.
Another thing that I don't know, this is something that's kind of weird. And anyway, it says so on this packaging. I think everybody I know, if they buy a threaded insert that looks like this, you see there's a which lens am I have?
Just hold it still. Back up a little bit. A little more. Can't focus that close. There you go.
Okay. You see there's a little slot cut in there?
Yep.
Yeah, you can see that there. Which end of this goes in the hole and which end goes up? Everybody I know says that slot is there to put a screwdriver in to screw this into the wood. They'll even tell you on this package, this insert is meant for that slot to go down in the hole. And the slot is actually acting like a drill bit. It's cutting the threads into the wood, and the gap from the slot appearing there is a place for the wood chips or the fibers to go inside.
Huh.
So you need, with something like this, you do need to have a T-wrench or something with a shoulder on it. I tried, and these are real obvious. It's so thin walled. I tried using a screwdriver on a couple of these, and every one of them broke. It was so fragile up on top here that the top 3 threads broke off, and of course part was in and part was out. And that's toast. Throw that away. So and I know there are heavier built ones, and they don't necessarily break off on those. But ever since I got these, and they had that statement right on there, the slot in these inserts is put there to cut thread in hardwood, not as a screwdriver slot. Place the slotted end of the insert in the hole and use a screw and a jam nut to drive. But I've been using that theory on all different kinds of them since then. I've never had any problem with that. So
I thought it was for a screwdriver.
yeah, it looks like it for sure. I mean, I don't know why. If it wasn't, if all manufacturers believe that same thing, why don't they all put that little tidbit of information on the packages when they ship them out? Save us a lot of hassle.
looks like we're at about 2 hours. I think we got time for maybe one more question, George. Is that okay?
I'm fine.
Okay.
Whatever.
Keith has got his hand up. Keith?
I don't have a question here, but boy, you know, I have a comment that, I mean, I've been in kind of a wasteland of finding any woodworkers in my area until I stumbled upon this group. And then I connected with George just recently when I started this nightstand project. And I cannot tell you how much I've learned just in the chats we've had and these videos now and all the stuff being posted online. I had no idea that this was, there were a nice enough group of people to share this kind of level of expertise. And it has upped my skill set tremendously. And I just want to say thank you. This has been a wonderful thing for me as a woodworker out in the desert.
It's awful nice to hear. We do have a great club, man. I gotta tell you, and a lot of knowledge out there and people willing to share. George being one of them, right at the top of the list. Yeah.
There are a lot of people in this club. That's Greg and I talked a little bit about some of that recently too. And it's it's one of those things that drew me into this club. It's just clearly you could see there were more names on you look at the roster on our website and how many people there are in all the different positions and how many people are volunteering for this, that, and the other thing. Where most clubs, it's a handful. And by a handful, I mean one hand, 5 people. And with 100 and 120 members, still only 5 people doing 95% of the work. And this club is the other way around, and it's great. I love it. It's very diverse skill sets and backgrounds and exposures, and we've got metal workers that bring another level of knowledge that crosses over into wood, and a lot of other expertises too that have crossover. So we're benefiting from a lot of people. It's great.
Yeah. Yep. And I can echo your comments, Keith. I feel the same way. I've learned more than I ever possibly imagined with the club, and it continues every day. Yeah.
Truth.
Yep. That's great. Well,
unfortunately, people keep wanting to sell more wood and or give away more wood and tools, and some of us have problems with that.
It's only so they can get more wood, George.
Yeah. I need a bubble put over my shop. Nothing more can come in until something goes out.
Yeah, I wish that worked.
Yeah.
Well, George, we sure appreciate it. It's just awesome.
Yeah.
I'm over the next couple of days, it usually takes, I think, 24, 48 hours for the recording to hit my computer. And then I find it, and then I'll upload it to YouTube, and I'll get the little logo and everything put on it. So over the next few days, we'll have this up on YouTube too, so we can revert back and refresh our memories, because a couple of these things, I want to look back on. So it's great.
Well, if anybody thinks of any other questions after the fact, just go on the chat line and throw it out there. I'm looking on that pretty much every day. So
great.
Catch up with me or send me an email directly. That's fine. Call.
Great. And George, just in closing, I want to close with a couple of comments of people that have either had to leave or are leaving soon. George and crew, well done. You're a good teacher. This was time well spent. Hoping to see more videos like this. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And then another one from Nick. Awesome presentation, George. Thanks. So yeah, we do appreciate it. Really do.
Happy to do it.
All right. Good deal. Okay, well, let's not everybody go over to George's shop tomorrow and talk to him. give the poor guy a little break.
Tomorrow. Somebody can come and help me put all this stuff away.
Yeah, and actually get something built.
I got work to do on that. It's that's where it is right now.
Looks good. Now, what was the background on that, George? Was that a commission piece? Daryl got a commission and tossed it over to you? Yeah.
Daryl had on his website that he had 2 of these in inventory to sell.
Oh.
And a guy called and said, "Hey, I'll take them." And then yeah, Daryl had to tell him, oops, I actually sold one of those a couple of months ago and I hadn't gotten my website updated. So he said, well, okay, just build me another one then. So Daryl didn't want to build it. So he asked me if I wanted, I'd be willing to do it. So I'm building a second one to match the one that he had already built.
Ah, good deal.
But this is the first one of these I've done. So
Oh, really?
it's going a little slower, but it's working fine. As you can see, there's finish on. I pre-finished all of the inside faces.
Yeah.
Just because it's tight quarters to try and get in after everything's glued up to try and it's a stained and then top and clear coat over that. So to get the stain distributed and wiped out and uniform would have been tricky. So I masked off all the joinery and the glue surfaces and did the staining and 2 coats of top coat. Yeah, or one coat. And I'll do one more after it's all put together now. So, but I'm onto the drawers tomorrow.
Okay.
So that's got to be out the door in a couple of weeks. So
Well, if Greg wouldn't mind just camping out at your house tonight, and then when you start working on that tomorrow, he can have the camera rolling. We'd appreciate it.
I think I've already been camping out.
there's been no overnighters, but there've been pretty good chunks of the day.
Pretty close to it, huh? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's all good. It's all good. I appreciate the help. The camera work and managing the technology to do this kind of thing is making a big difference for what we can offer. So it's
Yeah.
I'm glad we have people in the club willing to do this kind of stuff.
Yep. Greg, we can't thank you enough, man, for doing this and being the camera op and director and producer and everything else. So it's worked out great.
Hey, I got to have the stool, so it's okay.
You're gonna have to put your name across the back of it.
I was gonna say, would it have killed George to have a director's chair there for you with your name on it? Maybe a gold star or something?
Next time.
All right. All right, guys. Well, it's 9:15, so we probably ought to sign off. And
Thanks, guys.
we will go from there.
All right.
Thank you again, George.
Absolutely.